Hello, and thanks for joining us for our continued study in the book of Jeremiah. We are now in the second lesson of this series. In lesson number 1, we saw an introduction to the book of Jeremiah, understanding that he is going to be the writer talking about the events that happen in Jerusalem right up to the invasion by the Babylonians and the destruction of the city. But he begins his work back during the days of Josiah. And here is a king that is trying to do what is right. And he's trying to encourage the people to put away their idols. And he is able, on a superficial level, to destroy idols and try to stamp idolatry out of the land. But unfortunately, he's not able to erase it from the thinking of the people. And we find in later history, after the reign of Josiah, they went right back to the idolatrous practices that had been in place prior to Josiah's reign. Looking at lesson 2 now, we're actually going to be able to start examining text from Jeremiah chapter 1 and Jeremiah chapter 2. And so we're using as the core for our study a workbook study written by John Humphreys, in which he is looking at the writings of Jeremiah, both the book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. And so we'll go to lesson 2 and begin simply looking at the questions that he has in this particular lesson. Question 1, he says, at the time that Jeremiah began his ministry, who was the king of Judah and what were the conditions in the land? From Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests that were of Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. We find by going over to 2 Kings and looking at chapter 22 and verse 1, that Josiah assumed the throne of Judah at the age of 8, and he reigned for 31 years. Then his father, Amon, had reigned for 2 years, and his grandfather Manasseh had reigned for 55 years. And during that 57-year span, both Manasseh and Amon had both been very involved in encouraging idolatry in the land. So now Josiah steps onto the throne and begins to try to reverse this trend that had been established by his father and by his grandfather. In question 2, it says, how did Jeremiah react to his call as a prophet? Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 6. It says, behold, looking at verse 6, then said I, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. Jeremiah felt very inadequate to the task. He felt that he didn't know what to say. How am I going to be able to turn this people when I am so limited in my abilities? But God says, I'll help you. And so the prophet moves forward. In question 3, it says, in what way was Jeremiah over nations and kings? That phrase is used in verse 10. He says, see, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. We find that Jeremiah was going to be helped by God to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down the sin of the nations that he's going to be addressing, and also to build and to plant what was the good instruction of God, with instruction and hope being given as to what was going to happen further down the road. In question 4, the author asks, what 2 items illustrated God's judgment against Judah, and what did they mean? And this is from Jeremiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 11 and going to verse 15. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Jeremiah, what seest thou? And I said, I see a rod of an almond tree. And then said the Lord unto me, Thou hast well seen, for I will hasten my word to perform it. And the word of the Lord came to me the second time, saying, What seest thou? And I said, I see a seething pot, and the face thereof is toward the north. Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For lo, I will call all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah. The two things that Jeremiah sees as God asks him to look around and see what's there is he sees a rod that is made out of almond wood. Now, almond wood, as I understand it, is a tree that blooms early in the spring. And here God says that it's good that you saw that this rod was made out of almond wood, because I will hasten my word to perform it. This is something that's going to happen soon, and the captivity was not very far away. But then he says, what else do you see? He says, I see a seething pot, or a boiling pot, that was facing the north. And of course, God uses this to remind him that the invaders would come from the north. And this, of course, is a reference to the invasion of the Babylonians. In question 5, the author asks, why was God bringing such severe calamity against the cities of Judah? Well, in chapter 1 and verse 16, that is explained. God says, I will utter my judgments against them, touching all of their wickedness, who have forsaken me, and have burned incense unto other gods, and worshiped the works of their own hands. God said there's wickedness in Judah. They've forsaken me. They're not worshiping and following me. And they've burned incense to other gods, and they've worshiped the works of their own hands. In other words, they've created idols. They've carved them out, made them fancy, and then they fall down to worship them. And so he said they've forgotten completely about me and my ways, and as a result of that, my patience is exhausted and calamity is coming. In question 6, what did God tell Jeremiah to preach to the people? Well, let's look at verse 17 of chapter 1. Thou therefore gird up thy loins, and arise and speak unto them all that I command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. He said, your job is to simply speak all that I command you to say. There's going to be some of that that might be encouraging and words of hope, but there's going to be a lot of it that is condemnation. But Jeremiah was to speak the things that God told him to say. That was going to take courage. And God says, if you won't do that, he said, I will confound thee before them. You'll have trouble. But if you'll just listen to me, say what I tell you to say, the message will be delivered to Judah just as is necessary. In question 7, it said, did the Lord forget his people and their commitment to him? Well, no. Whenever God is reflecting here on what's going on in chapter 2 and going down to verse 2, he says, go and cry in the years of Jerusalem, saying, thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thy espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in the land that was not sown. He says, I remember the way it used to be. I remember your early love for me, but now you won't listen. And so, Jeremiah, you're going to have to bring this out to the people, and don't be intimidated by the mean looks and the rejection they throw your way. He said, you're going to have to tell them, you were faithful, but now look to where you have gone. In question 8, he says, but what did the nation of Israel do in return for God's blessings? Here God had delivered the land to them. Under the leadership of Joshua, they drove out the tribes that were there. They had a land that flowed with milk and honey. God had fulfilled his promise. He had allowed them to have great prosperity while they were in the land. But look at them now in chapter 2 and verse 5. Thus saith the Lord, what iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain. They said, you've forgotten about me. You have forsaken me, and you're walking in vanity, and you are vain. You are simply worthless. In other words, you have turned to the serving of these worthless idols. You're following mere fictions that have been made up, things from the human imagination, and you call it religion. You call it service to God, and none of it is worth anything. In question 9, it says, what did the people of Israel turn to when they rejected the Lord? Well, here in verse 5, he said that their iniquity had turned them, they'd gone far from me. And down in verse 8, it says, the priest said not, where is the Lord? And they that handle the law knew me not. The pastors also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after things that do not profit. He said, you're following your own wisdom. You're being led by false prophets and the false priests of Baal. You're not seeking counsel from the true God. You're doing whatever you want to do. He says in question 10, what 3 or 4 groups of leaders failed the Lord and his people? Well, here in verse 8, let's look at that slowly. He says, the priests said not, where is the Lord? So the priests are not being faithful to God. They're priests that are serving Baal. They're not interested in the instruction from the Lord. And they that handled the law knew me not. So the lawyers, which would entail scribes and the Levites, they were not refreshing people's memory about the law of Moses. They were simply looking at civil law. He said the pastors or the shepherds and guides in the land are transgressed against me. So there's no voices of reason encouraging people as a conscience factor to turn back to God. Jeremiah is pretty much alone in this. He says, and the prophets prophesy by Baal and walk after things that do not profit. So if you're looking for prophetic instruction, you're going to these false prophets of Baal. You're not consulting me as the great God that has always been the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Instead, you're following after idolatrous practices. In question 11, what very unusual thing did Israel do as a nation? Well, this is pointed out as God's talking to Jeremiah here in Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. He says, for pass over the isles of Chittim and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing. Hath the nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. He said, you've traded your knowledge of God and all of the service that I have rendered unto you, and you changed it instead for following these dumb and powerless idols. They can't talk to you. They don't give you instruction. But all that I've done, you've forgotten. And somehow you think that magically these idols that cannot move themselves, that cannot speak, that cannot do anything, you're trusting in them as if they're going to save you. In question 12, how did the Lord illustrate this terrible action on the part of the people? Well, here in verse 13 of chapter 2, it says, for my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. He said, I'm the fountain of living water here. I am your source that is constant and abundant and will take care of you. But you've traded all of that for cisterns that you've carved out yourselves, these idols that you've built. But they're like broken cisterns. They won't even hold water. But yet you are trusting in them even though they are of no value. In question 13, he says, whose fault was it that the Lord brought judgment upon Israel? Well, here in chapter 2 and verse 17, he says, hast thou not procured this unto thyself, in that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way? He said, you've forsaken the Lord thy God. You have brought this judgment upon yourself. I was there. I was faithful. I would have taken care of you. I would have helped you with all of your burdens. But you forgot about me and turned away and went into error. In question 14, he says, how obvious was the people's involvement with idolatry? Well, it was everywhere. In the 2nd chapter in verse 20, we find, he say, for of old time I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bands, And thou saidest, I will not transgress, when upon every high hill and under every green tree thou wanderest, playing the harlot. He said, now I brought you out of Egyptian bondage. I brought you to the land of promise. I delivered you from your adversaries time and time and time again. But then you said, I won't transgress. You're pretending like you're still following me. But he says, idolatry is evidenced on every high hill and under every green tree. You've built images, you've set up shrines, you're following these false gods, and the evidence of it is everywhere. In question 15, it said, could the people avoid the guilt of their apostasy by simply denying it? See, the people want to say, oh, we still worship God. Well, we still fear God. We still think about him from time to time. But in reality, their trust was in their idols. So no, they couldn't avoid their guilt, because God had said from the very beginning in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other God before me, and you will not bow down to any graven images. But that's exactly what the people of Judah were doing. He says here in verses 22 and 23 of this second chapter, he says, for though thou wash thee with nitre, and take thee much soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord God. How canst thou say, I am not polluted? I've not gone after Balaam. See thy way in the valley, and know what thou hast done. Thou art a swift dromedary traversing her ways. He said, you can't wash off all these sins. It's like a stain on a garment. You can't wash yourselves clean. And he said, your way is as unpredictable as a wild camel. That's a dromedary. The destruction that it wreaks havoc whenever it turns itself loose. He said, you've got the idols of Baal everywhere. You're running here and there, following after all of this stuff that is patently wrong. In question 16, how did God illustrate the Jews' rebellious determination to follow their idols? Well, let's look here at verses 23 and 24. How canst thou say, I am not polluted? I have not gone after Balaam. See thy way in the valley, know what thou hast done. Thou art a swift dromedary traversing her ways, a wild ass used in the wilderness that sniffeth up the wind at her pleasure. In her occasion who can turn her away? All they that seek her will not weary themselves. In her month they shall find her. The two illustrations that he uses here is, first of all, you can see the evidence of idolatry everywhere you look. But then he uses illustrations to show the devastating effects of this. He talks about that dromedary, that camel, that runs hither and thither when it's on a wild terror and causes all kinds of carnage as a result of it being out of control. But then he follows that up with the illustration of a wild donkey that is in heat and is seeking a mate. It's driven. It's unmanageable. It has its attentions fixed on something else, and you're not going to be able to capture it, nor are you going to be able to tame it down as long as those passions are running so high. And he said, that's what you're doing. You're having a passion for following after idolatry, and yet whenever I talk about you not serving me, well, the temple's still over there, and we still go through the motions of offering sacrifices over there and saying, oh, how much we love God. But their heart and their passion is in their idolatry. In question 17, it says, when the rebellious nation of Judah was about to fall to the Babylonians, what challenge did the Lord issue to the people? Here in verse 28 of the second chapter. It says, but where are thy gods that thou hast made thee? Let them arise, if they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah. He said, call on your idols to save you. Whenever the Babylonian army is camped outside your gates, call upon your idols to see if they're going to do anything to save you. He said, you've got so many idols. And in fact, he mentions it here in question 18. How widespread was the idolatry in Judah? He said that you've got as many idols as the number of thy cities. You are simply determined to follow after these other gods, and you have forgotten about me, and there's a price to be paid for that. In question 19, he says, did God attempt to correct the nation? Well, let's look at verse 30. He says, in vain I have smitten your children. They received no correction. Your own sword hath devoured your prophets like a destroying lion. He said, yes, I've tried to reach out to you. I've tried to correct you in many different ways. But the second part of this question, if so, was this attempt successful? He said, no. The punishments did no good. The prophets that I sent you took the sword and killed them. You would not listen. You would not turn. In question 20, what illustration did the Lord use to point out the forgetfulness of the people? Here in chapter 2 and verse 32, he said, can a maid forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forsaken me days without number. He said a bride, when she's getting ready for her wedding, she's not going to forget her ornaments and her attire, her dress and the fanciness of the occasion. Those are going to be things first and foremost in her thinking, and those things are going to be very, very important. But he said, I'm not important to you. You've forgotten all about me. There's no passion there to serve me. In question 21, did the Lord take notice concerning the shedding of innocent blood? Yes, he did. In verse 34, also in thy skirts is found the blood of the souls of the poor innocents. I have not found it by secret search, but upon all of these. Often, looking back to the lifetime of rule by Manasseh and Ammon, they offered children in human sacrifice. God said, you don't have to look very hard to see what was being practiced and done. The blood's everywhere. Sometimes it makes you stop and think about the innocents that are butchered in this country, very frequently the unborn, that suffer at the hands of others, and they've done nothing wrong themselves. The Lord takes notice of such things. In question 22, the author asked, did the people of Judah recognize that they had sinned against God? No, they were in denial. They simply convinced themselves that they could serve God a little bit and serve these idols too, and it would all be okay. They were just trying to cover all their bases. And so they have some activity going on over there at the temple to say, we're worshiping God, but then there's also going to be a lot of activity at all of these pagan shrines and all of these idols that are set up across the land. He says here in chapter 2 and verse 23, remember, he said, how canst thou say, I am not polluted? I have not gone after Balaam. See thy way in the valley. Know thou what thou hast done. He said, you can see it. It's all around you. And down in verse 35, he said, yet thou sayest, because I am innocent, surely his anger shall turn from me. Behold, I will plead with thee, because thou sayest, I have not sinned. He said, you are so blind. You are in denial. The evidence is everywhere that you're worshiping other gods besides me. In question 23, would the nation's political agreements with the pagan nations protect Judah from invasion by the Babylonians? And God says, no, I'm your protector. And there's not another nation on earth that can stand in for you and protect you. In chapter 2 and verse 36, why gaddest thou about so much to change thy way? Thou also shalt be ashamed of Egypt, as thou wast ashamed of Assyria. Egypt and Assyria both could not save and help them to avoid the calamity coming by the hand of the Babylonians. They'd experienced disappointments before, and there was not going to be any salvation coming from these nations now. And then finally in question 24, to the Oriental mind, what did the placing of the hands upon the head signify? He says here in verse 37, yea, thou shalt go forth from him, and thine hands upon thy head. For the Lord hath rejected thy confidences, and thou shalt not prosper in them. Whenever in the Oriental cultures they were going through tremendous emotional anguish and turmoil, there was the throwing of dust in the air. There were the idea of rending their garments. There was the idea of running around with their hands on their heads, all upset in anguish and complete dismay because of things happening to them. The story over in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 19 as to how Tamar reacted. Remember, she had been raped by her half-brother Absalom, and then he threw her into the street and would have nothing else to do with her. And we find in verse 19 of 2 Samuel 13, and Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hands on her head, and went on crying. Just the idea of, oh no, oh no, oh no, this is terrible. And God is saying here through Jeremiah that whenever your calamity comes, you're going to behave the very same way. You're going to be in anguish of spirit, but you are going to have to learn you brought it on yourself because of your sins and iniquities. So here we've seen Jeremiah's calling, that he was going to have a difficult job in preaching to a people that would not want to listen. And then as he begins to talk to them about their root problem of idolatry, you're going to resent that. You're going to reject it and say, oh, no, 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 no. We're still worshiping at the temple. We still have a fear of God, but really their allegiance and their focus and attention was on their idols and the trust that they had in them. And so that's going to be the root issue that Jeremiah is going to approach with these people and talk about the sin that accompanies all of their iniquities relative to their idolatry and their lack of confidence in God. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this second lesson as we've looked at the material given here about these first 2 chapters of Jeremiah, and we hope that you'll join us next week as we continue in our study.